The morning air over Denver International Airport carried the faint chill of autumn. Sunlight broke across the tarmac in long golden streaks, glinting off the silver fuselage of the Boeing 777 waiting at Gate 42. Flight 227 was scheduled to depart for Boston at 7:15 a.m. A routine flight across the country that would normally be forgotten as soon as it ended. For the passengers, it was just another day, another flight. Yet, hidden in the ordinary was the beginning of something extraordinary, an event that would echo in headlines and history for years to come. Inside the terminal, families hugged their goodbyes. A young mother bounced her toddler on her hip while trying to balance a carry-on bag. A businessman in a sharp suit muttered into his phone, already immersed in a meeting that hadn't started. Two college students wearing hoodies laughed at a joke only they understood. None of them knew that fate had quietly chosen them to be bound together in the hours ahead. In the cockpit, Captain Elena Ramirez ran her fingers across the checklist. Every switch, every dial, every system had to be accounted for. Though she was now a veteran of hundreds of commercial flights, she never allowed herself to treat a checklist as routine. Flying was a privilege, not a guarantee. Behind her calm eyes was a history that few of the passengers knew. Before she wore the crisp navy blue uniform of a commercial airline captain, she had worn the flight suit of the Air National Guard. Her call sign back then had been Valkyrie, a warrior name, given not for recklessness, but for her uncanny ability to stay composed when the skies turned hostile. The co-pilot, First Officer Jason Monroe, glanced at her. He was younger, barely 30, still in the early years of his career. There was a quiet respect in his eyes when he looked at Elena. Her reputation as both a leader and a mentor was well known within the airline. She had a way of making the cockpit feel less like a workplace and more like a sanctuary of focus. "Systems green, Captain," Jason reported. Elena nodded, adjusting her headset. "Copy that. Weather looks clean over the Midwest. Boston's got some crosswinds, but nothing serious. Smooth ride for most of the way." She said it with a steady confidence, but deep inside, she carried the unshakable knowledge that aviation was always a dance with the unknown. She'd seen weather turn savage in minutes. She'd seen machinery betray its pilots at the worst possible time. And she'd seen, far too often, how panic could claim lives before physics did. Boarding began. The cabin filled with the usual symphony of chatter, rustling bags, and the sharp clicks of seatbelts snapping shut. In the back row, a teenager plugged in his headphones, already lost in music. A pair of elderly tourists flipped through a guidebook about Boston's historic sights. A service dog curled beneath the feet of a veteran, seated near the middle aisle. Every seat carried its own story, but soon all those stories would become one. At 7:13 a.m., the jet bridge pulled away. The engines rumbled to life, their low growl vibrating through the cabin. To the untrained ear, it was the comforting sound of departure. To Elena, it was the heartbeat of a living machine, one that demanded both respect and vigilance. "Tower, this is Flight 227, requesting clearance," she said into the mic. "Flight 227, cleared for takeoff, runway 34 left," came the reply. Elena pushed the throttles forward, and the aircraft surged down the runway. The force pressed passengers back into their seats, but in the cockpit, her hands were steady, eyes sharp. The Boeing lifted from the ground, climbing gracefully into the sky. The city of Denver shrank below them, replaced by the endless sprawl of clouds stretching toward the horizon. As the jet leveled into cruising altitude, the cabin crew began their routines. Coffee brewed in the galley, the aroma filling the aisles. Flight attendants handed out drinks with easy smiles, masking the quiet discipline drilled into them for emergencies. A sense of peace settled over the cabin, the kind of peace that makes passengers forget They are hurling through the sky in a machine heavier than a small ship. From her seat, the young mother sang softly to her toddler, who had finally fallen asleep against her shoulder. The businessman typed furiously on his laptop, deadlines ticking closer with every keystroke. The college students ordered sodas and laughed too loudly, drawing half-irritated, half-amused glances from the rows around them. Life carried on at 30,000 feet, suspended in a fragile balance that none of them questioned. In the cockpit, Jason leaned back. Smooth ride so far. Almost too quiet. Elena gave a faint smile. Never say that out loud. The sky hears you. Jason chuckled nervously, not sure if she was joking. But he remembered stories about her, how she once landed a fighter jet in near-zero visibility, guided only by instinct and radar. How she once pulled another pilot out of a spiraling stall during a training exercise. She had been tested before, and though she had left the military behind, the sky still seemed determined to test her again. For the next hour, nothing unusual happened. The Rockies faded behind them, the plains stretched below, and the flight crew moved with quiet efficiency. The passengers began to sink into the rhythm of travel movies, flickering on screens, books opening, seat reclines clicking back. The jet hummed forward, a steel bird in perfect balance. And yet, sitting in her captain's seat, Elena couldn't shake a strange unease. It wasn't fear. Fear had long ago been burned out of her by years of combat training. It was more like a whisper in her bones, a reminder that the sky, for all its beauty, could turn merciless in an instant. She adjusted the controls, checked the instruments again, then leaned back. Jason gave her a curious look. Something wrong, Captain? Elena hesitated, then shook her head. No, just listening. He didn't press. He didn't need to. Every pilot knew that sometimes instinct spoke louder than data. By 8:40 a.m., the aircraft was steady at cruising altitude. Breakfast trays had been served, laughter echoed softly through the aisles, and children pressed their faces to the windows to marvel at the endless quilt of clouds. To anyone else, it was the picture of calm. But fate had already begun to weave its threads. Far ahead, hidden beyond the calm sky, lay turbulence, machinery fatigue, and a chain of events that would push every soul aboard to the edge of survival. For now, though, they soared unaware, unafraid, and unprepared. Flight 227 had begun not just a journey across America, but a passage into legend. And at its helm sat a woman who would soon be asked to summon every ounce of strength, courage, and training she had ever known. Captain Elena Ramirez, once Valkyrie of the skies, had taken off with 180 lives in her hands. By the time this flight ended, those lives would all depend on her in ways no one could yet imagine. The flight had begun, and history was waiting. The Boeing 777 had been in the air for just over 2 hours when the first warning light appeared on the cockpit panel. It was small, barely more than a flicker, but Captain Elena Ramirez noticed it immediately. Years of military service had sharpened her eyes to details others would miss. The amber glow pulsed in the corner of her vision, an engine pressure warning. Jason Monroe, her co-pilot, leaned forward to confirm. Captain, I've got a fluctuation on the left engine. Elena studied the readings, her lips tightening. The gauges danced, oil pressure dipping dangerously low before bouncing back. Could be a sensor error, she said evenly. But her tone was wary. Should I run a diagnostic? Jason asked. Do it, Elena replied, her voice clipped but calm. She reached for the comms, considering whether to alert air traffic control. Not yet, she thought. Not until she knew what she was dealing with. In the cabin, the passengers were oblivious. Breakfast trays clattered as flight attendants served coffee and juice. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at the endless patchwork of fields below. The hum of the engines lulled others into sleep. The sky looked deceptively serene. But inside the left engine, invisible to everyone but the instruments, metal ground against metal. A stress fracture, tiny but deadly, had weakened the turbine blade. For the past hour, it had vibrated harder with every rotation. Now it was only a matter of time. At 9:12 a.m., time ran out. A deafening boom rocked the aircraft. The sound tore through the cabin like an explosion, rattling windows, shaking overhead bins. The left engine erupted in a ball of fire, shards of metal tearing free as the turbine shredded itself to pieces. Smoke and flames trailed from the wing, streaking across the sky. Passengers screamed. Coffee spilled. A food cart toppled sideways, slamming into a row of seats. Panic surged like a wave through the cabin, the sudden awareness that something was horribly, fatally wrong. In the cockpit, alarms blared. Red lights flashed across the control panel, filling the small space with urgency. Jason cursed under his breath, scrambling to stabilize the systems. Engine 1 failure, Elena barked, her hands already moving. She shut down fuel to the left engine, silencing the fire for now, though smoke still bled from the torn casing. The plane jolted, dipping into a steep bank as the imbalance pulled it sideways. Jason's hands shook as he adjusted the yoke. "We're losing altitude fast." Elena pressed her palm against the controls, steadying them with sheer strength. "Stay with me, Jason. Trust the training." But even she could feel the terrifying drop. The Boeing was descending at thousands of feet per minute, its nose dragging down despite her corrections. The passengers could feel it too, the lurch in their stomachs, the weightlessness of falling. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a hiss. The cabin lights flickered. A woman screamed, "We're going down." Her words sparked hysteria. Some passengers sobbed into their masks. Others clawed at their armrests as if gripping them could keep the aircraft aloft. In row 24, a man whispered a prayer, his lips trembling. Beside him, a young girl buried her face into her mother's shoulder, trying not to cry. Through the chaos, the flight attendants tried desperately to keep order. "Masks on. Breathe normally." One shouted, her own mask strapped tightly across her face. But the tremors of fear spread faster than her voice could calm them. Back in the cockpit, Alana's mind worked like a machine. Cut off the left engine, done. Balance thrust on the right, trying. Adjust hydraulics, half responsive. Every second mattered. Every choice carried 180 lives. "Altitude's dropping through 20,000, Jason reported, panic edging into his voice. "Level it," Elena snapped, her eyes locked on the horizon. "Don't fight the descent, control it." The jet shuddered violently, buffeted by air resistance. Elena could feel it resisting her like a wild beast, fighting against her control. Her muscles burned as she held the yoke steady. The ground rushed closer. Colorado's vast plains stretched below them, deceptively calm in the morning light. To the passengers, it looked like the end of the earth pulling them down faster than they could escape. Jason's breathing quickened. "We're not going to make it, Captain." Elena turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. Her voice was low, steady, unyielding. "We will. Stay with me." Something in her tone snapped him back. He forced his hands to steady, following her lead, matching her corrections. The descent slowed, slightly still dangerous, but survivable. Then, as if fate wasn't finished testing them, a new alarm blared. Cabin depressurization. Elena's stomach clenched. "Masks down now," she ordered. She yanked hers into place, her voice muffled as she spoke through the mic. "Flight attendants, secure the cabin. Passengers, put your masks on immediately." In the cabin, chaos reigned. Some passengers had already fainted from the sudden loss of oxygen. Others struggled to adjust their masks, their hands trembling too badly to secure the straps. A flight attendant knelt in the aisle, helping a child fit his mask, even as her own eyes watered from the thin air. The jet howled as the pressurized cabin vented into the sky. Loose papers whipped through the aisles. The temperature plummeted, turning breath into frosty clouds. "Dropping to 10,000 feet, Elena said firmly, forcing the jet into a controlled emergency descent. "We'll give them air." Jason's eyes flicked over the controls. "Right engine straining under full load, Captain." "It can't hold us forever." "Then we don't give it forever," she replied, her voice ironclad. For 7 endless minutes, the aircraft dropped like a wounded bird. Inside, passengers clutched one another, their cries drowned by the roar of the engines and the banshee wail of wind against the fuselage. Some prayed aloud. Others sat in stunned silence, already surrendering to the belief that their lives were over. But in the cockpit, Elena refused surrender. Her jaw clenched, sweat beading on her forehead. Every decision had to be exact, every adjustment precise. Her heart hammered, but her hands never wavered. She had faced worse in the military combat zones, evasive maneuvers under fire. She had been trained for chaos. Only this time, there was no backup, no wingman flying alongside her. Only her. Only 180 lives depending on her ability to do the impossible. And as the aircraft leveled out, finally stabilizing around 10,000 feet, a thin thread of hope returned. The oxygen masks still hung, passengers still sobbed, but the screaming descent had slowed. Jason exhaled shakily. "We're alive." Elena didn't answer. She knew they had only survived the first wave. Ahead lay decisions that would demand more than skill. They would demand faith. She adjusted her headset, trying to raise air traffic control. But static hissed in her ear. The explosion had crippled the radio systems. Their voices couldn't reach the ground. The passengers were looking to the crew. The crew was looking to her. And the skies? The skies offered no mercy. For the first time in years, Elena Ramirez, once Valkyrie of the skies, felt the weight of her past pressing forward. She had walked away from her call sign long ago. But now, as silence crackled through the failing comms, she realized she might need to call on it again. The trouble had only begun. The cockpit of Flight 227 was a storm of alarms, flashing warnings, and shaking metal. The Boeing 777 was no longer the calm, steady bird it had been just an hour ago. It was a wounded beast, limping through the sky. Every groan of the fuselage a reminder of how close it was to failing completely. Captain Elena Ramirez kept her hands on the controls, every muscle taut. Her eyes moved from instrument to instrument in a rhythm honed by years of flying. Airspeed dropping. Altitude just under 10,000. Right engine overstressed, but still alive. Cabin pressure stabilizing but weak. It was a grim symphony, each reading singing a note of danger. Her co-pilot, Jason Monroe, was breathing too fast. His hands trembled slightly on the yoke, and though he tried to keep his focus, panic was creeping into his voice. "Captain, hydraulics are sluggish. The right wings, she's not responding cleanly. If we lose the second engine—" "Stop," Elena cut him off sharply. Not cruel, but firm, unyielding. Her tone carried the authority of a commander, not just a captain. Jason froze, meeting her eyes. "You're letting fear talk," she said, steady and calm. "I need you, not fear. Fear doesn't fly airplanes. Pilots do." Jason swallowed hard, nodded, and forced his breathing to slow. He gripped the yoke tighter, forcing his mind back into the present. Elena's words had hit him like a shock. For a moment, he remembered why he had always admired her unflinching presence. The way she could silence chaos just by refusing to yield to it. "Good," she said softly, then turned her focus back to the instruments. "Now listen carefully. We're not passengers. We don't sit back and let the sky decide what happens to us. We take control, one decision at a time. That's how we live through this." Outside the cockpit, the passengers clung to their oxygen masks, still shaken from the sudden dive. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke, though the fire had been extinguished. Flight attendants moved quickly, checking rows, comforting crying children, strapping down loose carts. They looked toward the cockpit door more than once, their eyes silently asking the same question. "Are we safe?" In the cockpit, Elena answered that question with every action she took. She adjusted thrust on the surviving engine, redistributing power to compensate for the loss of the left. The aircraft responded unevenly, shaking as though resisting her. "Stabilizer trims unbalanced," Jason reported. "Manual adjust," Elena ordered. "Small inputs. Let her breathe." The yoke strained against her hands, a constant reminder that the Boeing was massive, heavy, and wounded. It wanted to dive, to roll, to give up. She wouldn't let it. Minutes passed. The descent had slowed, but the aircraft was still dropping bleeding altitude, like a patient losing blood. Elena knew they couldn't hold like this forever. The right engine was working harder than it was designed to. At any moment, it could overheat, seize, or flame out entirely. And yet, she didn't allow her voice to waver. "We've still got sky under us. As long as that's true, we fight." Jason glanced at her, then back to the instruments. "You sound like you've been here before." Elena allowed herself the briefest of smiles, though her eyes never left the panel. "I've been in worse places. Once over Kandahar, I flew a jet with a wing half gone. My wingman kept telling me to eject. I told him, as long as she's flying, I'm flying. And I brought her home." Jason shook his head, almost in disbelief. "And they called you Valkyrie for that, right?" Her eyes flickered, but her tone stayed matter of fact. "They called me Valkyrie because I didn't let fear win. Same rule applies here." The name hung in the air between them. Valkyrie. It was more than a call sign. It was a legend, one she had thought she'd left behind. But the skies had a cruel way of reminding her who she was. A sudden jolt rattled the jet, throwing Jason against his harness. Warning alarms shrieked again. "We've got a hydraulic leak, pressure's dropping." Elena cursed under her breath. The hydraulics controlled critical surfaces, rudder, elevators, ailerons. Without them, steering the plane would become nearly impossible. She gritted her teeth, forcing calm into her voice. "Switch to alternate system. We'll fly her like she's half paralyzed." Jason's hands scrambled over the switches. Alternate engaged. Controls still heavy. "Then muscle through it," Elena said. Her arms ached from the resistance of the yoke, but she pushed harder, refusing to let the aircraft slip from her grip. Her entire body became part of the machine, every breath, every motion calibrated to keep the jet steady. Down in the cabin, the turbulence grew worse. Overhead compartments rattled. A baby wailed. Passengers gripped their seats, as though their hands alone could hold the aircraft together. One man shouted in panic, trying to rise from his seat before a flight attendant forced him back down. The atmosphere was raw, every face pale with fear. But if they could see the cockpit, they would have seen a woman who looked uncheckable. Exhausted, strained, but uncheckable. Elena's voice broke through Jason's spiraling thoughts once more. "Listen to me. This is where people die not from the fall, not from the failure, but from giving up. We don't give up. Not today. Not on my watch." Jason found himself nodding, the fear in his chest easing into determination. She was right. As long as she fought, As long as she believed they could make it, he couldn't do anything less. The alarms continued to wail. The instruments continued to paint a grim picture. But inside Elena's mind, the noise faded. She slipped into a place only combat pilots knew: a cold, sharp focus where nothing existed but the aircraft, the sky, and the choices she made. She trimmed the controls again, felt the aircraft respond, and whispered almost to herself, "That's it, girl. Stay with me?" The Boeing groaned but held. It was flying. Barely, but it was flying. Jason looked at her, eyes wide. "How are you so calm?" Elena didn't glance at him. "Because calm saves lives. Panic doesn't. Panic is the enemy. And I don't let enemies win." The silence that followed was heavy, but no longer hopeless. Jason sat taller, steadier. The aircraft, though wounded, remained in the sky. The passengers still breathed. And Elena Ramirez still had control. For now, she knew the next step was critical. They needed to get help, to communicate, to find somewhere safe to land before their fragile balance collapsed. The radio was still out, their link to the ground severed. But deep inside, Elena knew there was one option left. One she hadn't touched since her military days. Her call sign. She kept her eyes locked forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Jason, keep her steady. I'm going to try something. Old school." Jason frowned. "Old school?" Elena's hand hovered over the emergency frequency dial. She could already hear it in her head, the voice of command, the name she thought she'd left behind. Valkyrie. If she called, the sky would answer. She just prayed it would answer in time. The battle wasn't over. It was only beginning. The cockpit was dim, lit only by the flashing red and amber warnings that refused to stop screaming at them. Every time Jason silenced one alarm, another came alive, until the entire panel looked like a battlefield of angry lights. The aircraft had steadied at 10,000 feet, but it wasn't a clean flight. It was more like a wounded soldier staggering forward, bleeding strength with every mile. Jason ran another check on the radios, twisting knobs, adjusting dials, his fingers trembling with urgency. "Still nothing, Captain. Main comms are fried. Backup isn't transmitting cleanly. We're flying blind." Elena pressed her lips together. Blind. It was the worst word for a pilot. Up here, isolation was death. Without communication, there were no instructions, no diversions, no runway assignments, no guidance. It was just them and the machine. And 180 lives waiting in the cabin, their futures hanging in silence. Jason slammed the fist lightly against the console. "We're stuck. They don't even know we're out here." Elena's eyes narrowed. There was one way, one lifeline. But to use it, she would have to bring back a part of herself she had left behind long ago. Her fingers hovered over a dial on the lower panel, one she hadn't touched in years. The emergency military frequency, reserved for combat distress, for situations where civilian systems failed and the military had to step in. It wasn't meant for commercial pilots. It wasn't meant for her. But Elena Ramirez wasn't just a commercial pilot. She had been Valkyrie. The name tasted strange in her mind now, like an old song she hadn't sung in years. Valkyrie born in the chaos of Afghanistan, when she had guided crippled jets back to base under fire. Valkyrie, the call sign whispered with respect among her squadron, because she never gave in to fear. Valkyrie, the identity she had tried to bury when she traded her fighter jet for the captain's seat of a passenger plane. Jason noticed her hesitation. "What is it?" Elena took a slow breath. Her voice was steady, but her chest tightened with the weight of the decision. "There's one more channel we can try. But if I use it, it changes things." Jason frowned, not understanding. "Changes what?" "Changes who hears us." She adjusted the dial carefully, the faint static hissing into her headset. Military command. NORAD. They'll know who I am. Jason blinked. Wait, you mean your old call sign? Elena didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Yes. For a moment, silence filled the cockpit. Jason's breathing slowed. He had heard rumors about her past. Every young pilot had. Stories about Ramirez, the Valkyrie, the woman who pulled miracles from thin air. He thought they were just legends, stories told in flight school to inspire. But now, in this burning sky, the legend was real. Elena steadied her hand, tuned the frequency, and pressed the transmit button. Her voice, calm and commanding, cut through the static. Mayday, Mayday. This is Valkyrie. I repeat, this is Valkyrie. Boeing 777, engine 1 failure. Partial hydraulics, 180 souls on board. Request immediate assistance. Coordinates transmitting. Her words hung in the silence. For a few seconds, nothing came back but the hiss of static. The emptiness of it pressed against her chest like a weight. Had they heard her? Was anyone out there? Then, a voice crackled through the line. Firm, urgent, and tinged with disbelief. Valkyrie? Say again. Confirm call sign. Jason's eyes widened. Elena pressed the button again, her tone unshakable. This is Captain Elena Ramirez, former Air National Guard. Call sign Valkyrie. I am in command of Flight 227. Mayday. Immediate assistance required. There was a pause on the other end, a pause that carried both recognition and shock. Then the reply came, clear and sharp. Copy, Valkyrie. NORAD acknowledges. Stand by. Help is on the way. Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over his face. They heard us. Elena allowed herself the faintest nod. She felt it too, the weight in her chest lifting slightly. For the first time since the engine failure, they weren't alone. But this wasn't just about technical assistance. The moment she used that name, she knew everything had changed. The Air Force didn't forget its legends. Valkyrie wasn't just another pilot. She was a symbol. And now, with one desperate transmission, she had stepped back into that role, whether she wanted it or not. Down in the cabin, the passengers noticed nothing. They still clutched their masks, whispered prayers, and stared wide-eyed at the trembling ceiling panels. But in the cockpit, everything had shifted. For the first time since disaster struck, there was a connection to the outside world, a lifeline thrown across the sky. The radio crackled again, this time with urgency. Valkyrie, NORAD command. We've scrambled Raptors from Peterson Air Base. ETA to your position. 9 minutes. Maintain altitude if possible. Jason stared at Elena, barely able to believe it. F-22s. They're sending Raptors. Elena's jaw tightened, her grip steady. Good. We'll need them. Jason exhaled, almost laughing in disbelief. F-22s, escorting a passenger plane. This is unreal. Elena didn't smile. She didn't have the luxury. She knew what this meant. Raptors didn't scramble for routine emergencies. They scrambled for threats, terrorism, hijackings, catastrophic failures. For a passenger plane to call Valkyrie and summon fighter jets. This wasn't routine. This was history. She leaned back slightly, adjusting the yoke with aching arms. The aircraft groaned, but it held level enough. For now. Her mind flicked back, just for a second, to the faces of her old squadron. The camaraderie, the battles, the nights on foreign soil, when the sky itself felt like a battlefield. She had left that world behind, or so she thought. But maybe you never really left it. Maybe once the sky had claimed you, it never let go. The voice in her headset returned. Valkyrie, NORAD command. Fighters will intercept from your left. Flashing signal when in visual. Hold steady. She nodded to herself, even though they couldn't see it. Copy. We'll hold. Jason sat back, shaking his head in awe. You just called in fighter jets with a single word. Elena's eyes remained forward, focused on the horizon. Her voice was quiet, but unbreakable. Not a word, Jason. A promise. Valkyrie means we don't fall. Not today. Not ever. The static faded, replaced by the steady hum of the surviving engine. For the first time in the nightmare, the cockpit felt less like a coffin and more like a command post. Reinforcements were coming. The sky had heard her. In 9 minutes, the world would change again. The call had gone out. The world's most advanced fighter jets were airborne, racing through the thin Colorado air at supersonic speed. At Peterson Air Base, the klaxons had sounded less than 10 minutes earlier, echoing across the hangars like a war cry. Pilots sprinted across the concrete in their flight suits, helmets tucked under arms, mechanics scattering as the twin-engine Predators roared to life. Within minutes, 2 F-22 Raptors had lifted into the sky, afterburners igniting like twin suns against the pale morning horizon. Their mission was urgent. A crippled commercial jet, Flight 227, drifting dangerously toward populated airspace, its fate uncertain. But this wasn't just any distress call, it came from Valkyrie. A name whispered in fighter circles with something between reverence and awe. Major Ryan Falcon Hayes, lead pilot, adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his HUD. His voice was clipped, professional, but there was an undertone of disbelief. Control, Falcon copies. Valkyrie confirmed? The answer came sharp over the coms. Affirmative. She made the call herself. She's in command. Falcon glanced at his wingman, Lieutenant Sarah Blaze Carter, flying tight formation off his right. Her eyes widened behind the visor, but she said nothing. They both knew the stories. They had studied them in flight school, the missions, the impossible recoveries, the woman who had earned the call sign Valkyrie. And now, she was back in the air. Falcon copies, he said, tightening his grip on the stick. We'll bring her home. In the passenger jet meanwhile, aboard Flight 227, the passengers clung to every vibration, every groan of the wounded aircraft. Hours seemed to stretch with every minute. Mothers whispered lullabies to children, too scared to cry. Businessmen stared blankly at laptops they would never open again. Strangers held hands, as though they'd known each other forever. Somewhere in row 17, a teenager pressed his face to the window, eyes red from tears. Then, suddenly, he gasped. Look! Look out there! Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Out of the endless blue sky, 2 sleek shapes emerged, slicing through the clouds like blades of silver. Their forms gleamed in the sun, predatory yet graceful, their wings sharp, their presence undeniable. They weren't commercial jets. They weren't rescue helicopters. They were Raptors. F-22s. The teenager's voice broke into a shout, trembling with awe. We're not alone. Passengers rushed to windows, pressing against them, watching in stunned silence as the fighters took position. One slid to the left of the airliner, the other to the right, close enough for everyone to see the pilots' helmets gleaming inside. For a moment, fear gave way to something else, wonder. Some wept, some clapped, some whispered prayers of gratitude. Whatever this was, it meant they weren't abandoned in the sky anymore. In the cockpit, Jason's eyes widened as he spotted the Raptors sliding into formation. His voice cracked with relief. They're here. Oh my God, they're actually here. Elena Ramirez didn't move. She kept her hands steady on the yoke, eyes fixed forward. But inside, she felt the weight of those silver wings like a promise made flesh. The Air Force had heard her. Her call sign had been answered. A new voice cut into her headset, calm and steady. Valkyrie, this is Falcon. We've got your 6. We're not letting you go down alone. For the first time in hours, Elena allowed herself the smallest smile. Copy that, Falcon. Good to see you. Blaze's voice chimed in, softer but equally resolute. Valkyrie, it's an honor. Jason turned toward her, stunned. They know you. They should, Elena replied, her voice quiet. We flew the same skies once. Escort, the Raptors held position, each maneuver a display of precision. Every subtle shift of their wings seemed to steady the massive airliner, if only in spirit. The symbolism wasn't lost on Elena. These weren't just escorts. They were guardians. Their presence told every passenger on board that survival was still possible. Inside the cabin, a young woman filmed the scene with shaking hands, whispering into her phone. They sent fighter jets for us. They're flying with us. The video would later go viral, viewed by millions. The sight of Raptors beside a stricken passenger plane seared into history. In row 12, an elderly man clutched his rosary, tears streaking his face. They'll bring us home, he whispered. And somehow, everyone believed him. The plan back in the cockpit, Falcon's voice came through again. Valkyrie, we've got you on visual. NORAD wants you to divert to Colorado Springs. Longest available runway. We'll guide you in. Elena took a deep breath. Colorado Springs, military base. They were going to land her on steel built for warplanes, not commercial jets. It was risky, but maybe the only chance they had. Copy, Falcon, she said. We'll make the attempt. Jason's hands shook slightly as he scribbled notes on his pad. Captain, that runway isn't built for our weight. We'll make it. Elena cut in firmly. We don't get to choose perfect today. We take possible. A conversation in the skies as the airliner limped forward. Falcon's voice filled her headset again, steady as a heartbeat. You know, Valkyrie, I heard about you in training. Thought it was just a story. Elena adjusted the yoke gently, the strain evident in her arms. Most stories are half true, Falcon. Blaze chimed in, her voice softer. You pulled 3 jets out of a kill zone with no fuel. That's not half true. That's legend. Elena exhaled slowly. Legends don't matter. What matters is that these people make it home. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with respect. The kind only warriors of the sky could share. The passenger's perspective in the cabin, hope had taken root. A father leaned down to his daughter, pointing toward the Raptor outside their window. See that, sweetheart? That's an angel with wings. They're here to protect us. The little girl, no more than 6, pressed her tiny hands against the glass and whispered, Thank you. On the left side of the aircraft, Blaze saw her. Through the reflective canopy of her helmet, she caught sight of the child, waving with innocent trust. Blaze's throat tightened. She tilted her jet slightly in acknowledgement, the universal signal of a pilot's salute. The cabin erupted in cheers. For the first time since the engine exploded, laughter broke out. Hope had entered the cabin like oxygen. In the shadows of history as they flew, NORA, he tracked every move. Controllers whispered updates, Pentagon lines lit up, and newsrooms scrambled for scraps of information. A commercial jet escorted by Raptors hadn't been seen since 9/11s. This wasn't just survival, it was history unfolding in real time. And at the center of it was Elena Ramirez Valkyrie, once again guiding lives through the storm. The moment of resolve, Falcon's voice returned, sharper now. Valkyrie, you're approaching descent window. Hydraulics will be hell on touchdown. We'll clear airspace. You've got this. Elena's jaw tightened. Her hands were blistered from the yoke, her muscles screaming, but her voice was unbreakable. Falcon, Blaze, thank you for answering. You called Falcon replied. The sky listens when Valkyrie calls. Jason turned to her, awe written across his face. Captain, whatever happens next, this is the bravest thing I've ever seen. Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. Her focus was absolute. The runway was ahead. The Raptors were alongside. The passengers behind her were counting on one thing, that she would not let them fall. And as the crippled jet began its slow, agonizing descent, flanked by two of the deadliest aircraft ever built, one truth rang louder than the alarms in the cockpit. Hope had returned to the sky. The mountains of Colorado stretched far below, sharp ridges cutting into the horizon like the teeth of giants. The crippled Boeing 777 limped through the sky, its single working engine wheezing, hydraulics sputtering. At her side, Jason read back emergency checklists, but even the manual didn't have a scenario for this. Half the systems were fried. The jet's computer kept blinking one brutal word across the screen. Unstable. Elena Ramirez didn't need the reminder. She could feel it in every vibration, every stubborn groan of the airframe. This aircraft wasn't meant to fly anymore. It was meant to fall. And yet, 180 lives were sitting behind her. Lives that wouldn't accept falling. She keyed her mic, voice even. Falcon Blaze. Status check. You still with me? The Raptors, flanking the jet like guardian angels, answered immediately. Falcon's voice was firm. We're with you, Valkyrie. Colorado Springs is clear. Runway's hot. You've got priority landing. Blaze added softly. Airspace is yours, Captain. Bring them home. Elena's eyes narrowed on the horizon. The runway was still a faint, dark line, distant but approaching fast. It wasn't just steel and concrete, it was salvation. But between here and there was the hardest landing of her life. Inside the cabin the intercom crackled, passengers looking up through tears and fear as Elena's calm voice filled the air. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are preparing for an emergency landing. Please listen carefully to the flight attendants as they guide you through brace positions. We may hit the runway hard, but we will get down. Trust me, we're going home. For a moment, silence. Then murmurs rose. Passengers tightened seatbelts, clutched hands, and whispered prayers. A young boy looked up at his mother. Is she going to save us? The woman swallowed her fear and whispered back, Yes, she will. The cabin crew moved briskly, faces pale but voices steady. Heads down. Stay braced. Rows of passengers bent forward, clutching the seats in front of them. The cabin filled with the sound of breaths, sobs, and whispered names spoken as last words or desperate hopes. The descent begins. Speed 250, flaps 20, Jason called, his voice shaking as he tried to keep pace with the failing systems. But the hydraulics were sluggish, the flaps only half responding. The aircraft shuddered violently, nose twitching like a wounded bird fighting gravity. Elena gritted her teeth, muscles straining against the yoke. Sweat stung her eyes, but she refused to blink. Every fiber of her being poured into holding the jet steady. We're landing this, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Jason looked at her, realizing he wasn't just sitting beside a captain. He was sitting beside a legend, someone who had stared death in the face before and refused to bow. Gear down, Elena ordered. Jason flipped the lever. Grinding, screeching noises erupted from below the fuselage as the landing gear fought to deploy. The cockpit shook, then steadied. 3 green lights blinked weakly on the panel. Gear confirmed, Jason said, almost in disbelief. Good, Elena replied. Now comes the hard part. The Raptor's guidance. Valkyrie. Falcon's voice came sharp in her headset. You're drifting left. Crosswind is pushing hard. Correct to heading 210. Copy, Elena said, nudging the yoke. The Boeing resisted like a stubborn ox, but the nose swung slightly back on course. The Raptors adjusted with her, banking gracefully, their sleek silhouettes almost brushing the edges of her vision. From inside the cabin, passengers saw it too. 2 silver arrows flanking their battered jet, guiding them like shepherds leading a wounded giant. A cheer rippled faintly through the cabin, not loud, but powerful. Hope was still alive. Seconds to impact, the runway grew larger, filling the cockpit windows like the open arms of the earth. Elena's hands ached from the yoke, every tendon in her body screaming. Jason's voice cracked. 2,000 feet. Airspeed unstable. We're coming in hot. Elena's jaw clenched. We'll bleed it off. The stick fought her every inch, the Boeing lurching downward. She pulled back with everything she had, her shoulders burning. Come on, girl, she whispered to the plane, as if sheer will could keep metal together. At 1,000 feet, alarms blared. Too low. Terrain. Too low. Terrain. Jason shouted, We're sinking too fast. Elena barked back. I've got it. Her voice cut sharper than steel, silencing even fear. She throttled the remaining engine, coaxing the nose up, fighting the dive. The ground surged closer, the runway rushing forward like a target she couldn't afford to miss. The impact, the Boeing slammed onto the runway with a deafening boom, the impact rattling every bone in every body on board. The left landing gear shrieked in protest, sparks showering as metal scraped asphalt. The nose pitched down, then jerked back up as Elena fought the controls with sheer brute strength. The fuselage skidded, smoke and fire trailing behind. Oxygen masks swung violently. Overhead bins popped, and passengers screamed. The cabin filled with the sound of grinding steel, tearing rubber, and the terrifying screech of survival hanging by a thread. Brakes! Brakes! Jason shouted, slamming the levers. The jet shook violently, tires exploding one by one. Hold together. Elena growled, her arms straining like iron cables. The runway stretched endlessly, but the aircraft was slowing. Every second felt like eternity, the screech of death scraping just outside the windows. Finally, mercifully, the Boeing shuddered to a stop. Smoke rose in twisting columns. Silence fell. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then, from the cabin, an explosion of sound cheers, sobs, cries of relief. Strangers embraced. Parents clutched children. People kissed the floor, kissed each other, kissed life itself. They had survived. Aftermath, Elena sat frozen, her hands still gripping the yoke. Her arms trembled, every muscle spent. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths. Jason turned to her, wide-eyed, his voice breaking. You did it. You actually did it. Her eyes softened, though her voice remained quiet. We did it. Outside, the Raptors circled overhead, their presence a final salute. Falcon's voice came steady through the comms. Valkyrie, welcome home. For the first time since disaster struck, Elena closed her eyes and let a single tear fall. Not for herself, but for the miracles she had delivered. On the runway, rescue vehicles swarmed the scene, firefighters dousing the smoking landing gear, medics rushing passengers onto the tarmac. Cameras zoomed in from every angle, broadcasting live. The world was watching. And at the center of it stood Elena Ramirez, sweat-streaked, exhausted but unbroken. She stepped out of the cockpit last, her silhouette framed by smoke and sunlight. The passengers, the crew, the rescuers, every one of them knew. They were alive because of her. And above them, circling once more before disappearing into the horizon, 2 Raptors tilted their wings in a final gesture of respect. The signal was clear. The legend of Valkyrie was alive again. The jet lay broken, but upright on the runway, its fuselage streaked with black soot and its belly scorched from the brutal skid. Smoke curled into the sky in thin gray fingers, the smell of burnt rubber and scorched metal hanging heavy in the air. Emergency sirens wailed as fire trucks sprayed the smoldering landing gear, the spray of water glinting in the sunlight like a desperate blessing. Inside the cabin, the silence had broken into chaos, crying, laughter, and stunned disbelief, all woven into one overwhelming sound. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lead flight attendant's voice cracked over the intercom. We are safely on the ground. Please remain seated until directed." But no one really could. Some passengers collapsed against the seats in sobs. Others clutched each other in wordless gratitude. A woman in row 9 reached across the aisle and held the hand of a stranger, whispering, "We're alive. We're alive." Evacuation. The cabin doors were wrenched open by crew members, emergency slides inflating with a thunderous hiss. One by one, passengers began sliding down, their screams of fear turning into cries of relief when their feet hit solid ground. Mothers cradled children as they tumbled into the arms of waiting rescue workers. Elderly passengers were helped gently down, some unable to stop trembling. On the tarmac, survivors hugged fighters, kissed the ground, and lifted hands to the sky in prayer. Others simply sat down, stunned, unable to process that they had survived what had felt like certain death. Through it all, Captain Elena Ramirez remained in the cockpit, her hands still gripping the yoke, as though her strength alone was keeping the aircraft together. Jason touched her arm gently. "Captain, it's over. We're down." Her eyes blinked slowly, heavy with exhaustion. She finally let go of the controls, fingers stiff from holding them so tightly. With deliberate slowness, she removed her headset, setting it down like one might lay down a weapon after battle. "Go," she said quietly. "Help the crew." Jason hesitated. "What about you?" Elena looked forward at the smoke curling past the cockpit glass. "I'll be the last one out." Stepping into the light, when she finally descended the slide, the crowd of survivors on the tarmac erupted into cheers and applause. People pointed, cried out her name, reached for her hands. "There she is?" Someone shouted. "She saved us." Another screamed. A mother rushed forward, clutching her daughter, tears streaking her face. "You brought my baby back to me." Elena nodded softly, touched the child's head, but said nothing. Words felt hollow against the magnitude of what had just transpired. News crews had already arrived, cameras rolling, microphones thrust forward. The world was watching, and in the center of the storm was Elena Ramirez, the woman who had pulled off the impossible. The media storm within hours. Headlines exploded across every major network. She saved everyone on board. Valkyrie returns. Pilot brings jet down against all odds. F-22s escort miracle landing. Clips of passengers crying and cheering flooded the internet. The shaky phone video of the Raptors escorting the wounded Boeing went viral within minutes, shared by millions. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Valkyrie, hashtag Miracle Flight, hashtag She Saved Us. Elena's name was everywhere, but she couldn't bring herself to watch the coverage. While survivors gave interviews, recounting her calm voice and unshakable composure, she sat quietly in a corner of the hangar where they had gathered, sipping water and staring at the floor. Jason sat beside her, his face still pale but eyes filled with admiration. "Do you realize what you just did? You pulled off the impossible, Captain. You saved 180 lives. You're a hero." She shook her head slowly, her voice a whisper. "I just did my job." Jason laughed, incredulous. "Your job?" "Elena, most pilots wouldn't have even tried what you did. You stared death in the face and didn't blink." Her eyes lifted at last, meeting his. There was no pride in them, only weariness. Do you know what it feels like to hear every scream behind you and know that if you fail, it ends with you? That's not heroism, Jason. That's responsibility. That's duty. He said nothing after that, because deep down, he knew she was right. The survivors' gratitude hours later, as the passengers were escorted to buses, many stopped to approach her. Some simply said thank you. Others broke down crying, unable to express the magnitude of their gratitude. A man in his 60s, his hands trembling, took hers in both of his. I thought I'd never see my wife again. Because of you, I will. You gave me time I thought I'd lost. A young woman, still holding her phone tightly, whispered, "The world needs to know people like you exist." Even the little girl who had waved at Blaze from the window was brought forward. She looked up at Elena with wide eyes and said, "You're my angel." Elena knelt, brushed a lock of hair from the girl's face, and whispered back, "No, sweetheart. Angels are the ones who answered my call." She glanced skyward, where the Raptors had vanished hours earlier. Official recognition within days, the story dominated every channel. Politicians hailed her bravery. Military commanders spoke of her legacy. Invitations for interviews poured in from every network, every talk show, every magazine. The Air Force itself released a statement. Once Valkyrie, always Valkyrie. Captain Elena Ramirez reminded us today that courage in the skies has no expiration date. She was called to Washington for recognition, where senators and generals stood to applaud her. Medals were suggested. Speeches were written in her honor. Yet through it all, Elena remained distant, her mind always returning to the silence of the cockpit, the feel of the yoke fighting her hands, the sound of 180 breaths held in terror. Heroism felt like the wrong word. She hadn't sought glory. She had only sought survival. The inner conflict that night, alone in her hotel room, Elena stood at the window overlooking the Capitol. Lights twinkled in the dark, cameras still waiting outside, the city abuzz with her name. She should have felt pride, relief, triumph. Instead, she felt the weight of the call sign, "Once more Valkyrie." It had been resurrected, not because she wanted it, but because the world demanded it. She whispered to the empty room, "I never wanted to be a hero." But deep down, she knew it wasn't about what she wanted. It was about what others needed. The passengers needed a hero to believe in. The public needed a story of courage. The Air Force needed the reminder that legends never die. And maybe, just maybe, the sky itself needed Valkyrie again. A quiet moment before she left Washington, she visited a small park near Arlington, where statues of aviators stood in silent tribute. She placed her hand on the cold bronze of one pilot's wings and let the silence settle. Behind her, Jason approached quietly. "You know, Captain, they're going to remember you forever." She didn't turn. "That's not what matters." "Then what does?" he asked. She looked up at the stars, the same ones she had flown under countless times. That they lived. That they all went home. "That's enough." Jason nodded slowly. "Still, you should know. For every one of them, you'll always be Valkyrie." For the first time since the landing, Helena allowed herself a small, tired smile. Not for the headlines, not for the medals, but for the simple truth. She had given them back their futures. And maybe that was heroism after all. The roar of jets was gone now, replaced by the quiet hum of daily life. Yet the sound of the F-22s still lived in Elena's mind. Days had passed since the miracle landing, but sleep had eluded her. Each time she closed her eyes, she was back in the cockpit, the violent shaking, the alarms screaming, the helpless cries of passengers. And then, in the middle of that storm, came the steady thunder of fighter wings beside her, two Raptors slicing the sky in silent promise. It was a moment she couldn't forget, nor did she want to. The ceremony, They called it a recognition event, though everyone knew it was more than that. The Air Force had arranged a private ceremony at a hangar near Langley. Survivors, family members, fellow pilots, and officers gathered beneath the towering silhouette of a parked F-22. Its sleek body gleamed beneath spotlights, as though the jet itself were paying tribute. Elena stood off to the side, still uncomfortable under the weight of attention. She wore her old dress blues, freshly pressed, though the uniform felt strange after years away. The silver wings on her chest glinted under the hangar lights, a reminder of the call sign she thought she had left behind. At the podium, a general spoke words Elena barely heard. Courage, duty, composure under fire. Captain Ramirez not only saved every life on her aircraft, but she reminded us what it means to fly with purpose. Today, we honor her not just as a pilot, but as Valkyrie, the protector who answered a nation's call when the sky itself turned against her. Applause thundered through the hangar. Cameras flashed. Survivors rose to their feet, clapping, some crying. Elena nodded politely, but her gaze was fixed on two men in flight suits standing near the wings of the F-22, Blaze and Falcon. The escorts, the ones who had found her in the storm. Meeting the Raptors when the ceremony ended, she slipped away from the microphones and the handshakes, heading toward the men who had been strangers in the air, but brothers in fate. Blaze, the taller of the two, smiled as she approached. "Ma'am," he said simply, his voice steady, but his eyes full of respect. Elena shook her head. "Don't call me ma'am. Just Elena." Falcon, younger, grinned. "That's not what we called you up there. To us, you were Valkyrie." The name hung in the air, heavy yet comforting. Blaze extended his hand. "You flew that bird like no one else could have. We watched you fight for every inch of sky. You gave us a reason to keep formation, no matter what." Elena shook his hand firmly. "You gave me something too. When I saw your wings beside mine, I knew I wasn't alone. You don't know what that did for me." Falcon's grin softened into something more serious. "We did what any pilot would do. But you? You carried the weight of 180 souls and still had the guts to make that call. You reminded us what flying really means." For the first time since the ordeal, Elena felt her throat tighten. These men hadn't come to idolize her. They had come to share the bond that only those who fly in the crucible of danger could understand. Survivors speak later that evening. The hangar lights dimmed as survivors were invited to speak. One by one, passengers took the stage, their voices cracking as they described the terror of those final minutes and the relief of survival. A young soldier, uniform pressed and boots polished, saluted Elena from the stage. "Ma'am, I've faced firefights overseas. I've faced down things I thought would kill me. But nothing scared me like that descent. The only reason I'm here is because you didn't give up. For me, for all of us, you're more than a pilot. You're proof that heroes walk among us." The applause that followed was long, sustained, filled with gratitude so raw it made Elena's chest ache. She lowered her gaze, tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but still she fought the word hero. Because she knew that survival was never guaranteed. It was fought for, clawed from the jaws of chaos. A private conversation later, as the hangar emptied, Blaze found her again, standing quietly by the F-22. "You know," he said, resting a hand on the wing, "Valkyrie isn't just a call sign. It's a name pilots whispered about the protector who watches over the sky. When we heard that name come across the channel, we knew it was more than a signal. It was a promise. You lived up to it." Elena turned, her voice low. "I don't feel like a Valkyrie." One felt terrified. I felt helpless. I just did what had to be done. Blaze smiled faintly. "That's what makes you one. Reflection, In the days that followed, Elena returned to quiet life. The cameras moved on. The headlines faded. Survivors reunited with families, and the world spun forward as it always did. But for Elena, time slowed in quiet ways. At night, she would walk outside, tilt her head to the stars, and listen to the silence of the sky. She knew somewhere, raptors were still patrolling unseen, protecting the same air she had nearly fallen from. Sometimes she imagined Blaze and Falcon up there, banking through the clouds, wings gleaming like silver guardians. She smiled at the thought that if she ever faltered again, someone would answer her call. Legacy months later, she received a letter from a little girl, the same child who had called her an angel on the runway. The letter was written in uneven handwriting, decorated with stick figure airplanes. Dear Captain Ramirez, when I grow up, I want to be a pilot like you. Because you showed me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you fly anyway. Elena pressed the letter to her chest, tears falling freely this time. That, she realized, was the legacy worth carrying, not the medals, not the ceremonies, but the lives touched, the futures made possible because she refused to give up. Closing the sky on the anniversary of the flight, Elena returned to the base where the ceremony had been held. The Raptors roared overhead in formation, carving the blue with contrails that stretched like banners of honor. The sound shook her chest, familiar and powerful, and she lifted her hand in salute. Jason stood beside her, smiling softly. Still think you're not a hero? Elena lowered her hand, eyes still on the sky. Heroes aren't what I think I am. But maybe I was who they needed when they needed it most. As the Raptors banked one final time and disappeared into the horizon, Elena whispered the words she had carried silently since that day. They answered my call, and because of them, I'll never fly alone. The sky was quiet again, but in her heart, the roar of their wings would never fade. For Elena Ramirez Valkyrie, the story wasn't about survival or recognition. It was about the unbreakable bond between those who dare to fly and the guardians who stand ready to answer. And somewhere above, the sky itself seemed to echo back her truth. When courage calls, the sky always answers.